Okay, go. Be free. Be free, my child! This is gonna be a very densely packed video, so I encourage you to pause, get back to it whenever you need to, and make the most of it, honestly. Now, this process that I'm going to talk about here was actually developed by the Professor of Psychology of Planning and Insight of University of Sussex, Thomas Ormerod. Thank you, Tom, for letting me make this video, because honestly, I've got nothing better to do. So, yeah, thanks. Now, as the fellow that invented this process is the Professor of Psychology of Planning, it means that this process involves a lot of planning. You should only spend about 10% of your time actually writing the essay, 40% of your time doing reading, and 50% of your time should be spent planning. So the first thing we're gonna do is make a plan. Woohoo! So, where do you even start? What's usually the first thing you do when you're about to write an essay? You're probably gonna check out the title, right? One thing that's really important here is to dissect the title as much as you can before you do any sort of reading, any sort of writing, anything. The essay question tells you not only what you should write the essay about, but it also tells you what style of argument is required here. For example, if you've got describe, that basically just means write some information about this topic. If you've got evaluate, it probably means that there's something not alright about that topic. If it's critically evaluate, you need to remember that critical evaluation doesn't just mean that you have to criticize everything. Critical evaluation means that you need to consider both the positives and the negatives of the argument and basically make up your own conclusion about it. Essentially, it is really important to pay attention to the title and to actually see what it's asking you to do. I've also put a link in the description box below to an article that talks about these styles of arguments and what each keyword is actually asking you to do. So make sure you check that out if you're not sure, because it might just save your ass. For example, if you get the essay title, what are the major determinants of successful human problem solving? So in the case of this title, you don't really have a keyword that tells you whether you should describe it, compare it or contrast it, critically evaluate it. You don't get any of that. Which means that your argument should look something like successful human problem solving is based on these three factors, A, B, and C. And then you're gonna go on and write about why that is. That's gonna be your argument. That's gonna be the structure of your essay. Now, at this point, you might be very tempted to go ahead and start doing a bunch of reading and start writing straight away and just get into the essay writing process as quickly as possible. But don't do that. For God's sake, do not do that. Please, don't do that. This step is really important. If you go off and start writing and reading about your topic, you're gonna spend a lot of time doing something that is gonna be completely irrelevant in the end, because you might waste a lot of time on reading irrelevant material, and then halfway through you might realize that actually the argument that you're making doesn't really make sense, so you're gonna have to change your entire argument, and then you're gonna be angry and your essay is gonna be due in like 2 hours and you're gonna be like, Arr! At this point you might want to think about the macro structure of your essay. So to begin with, every essay should contain 3 key parts. Now, this is very important because apparently a lot of people leave these out. Anyway, every essay should contain 3 major parts: an introduction, a body paragraph, and a conclusion. Introduction and conclusion are just as important as the body paragraphs, unless maybe you're writing an essay under exam conditions and the lecturers told you that you should skip introduction because you're not gonna have time to write an entire essay if you could focus on an introduction as well. So, what I recommend is literally take a piece of paper, grab your iPad, write it down in your computer, whatever, just write it down somewhere. Write down introduction, body, and conclusion. That's the main structure of your essay. Now, you've already taken a look at your title. When we think about it, even without any background reading or anything, this might depend on numerous things. How hard the problem is, what we have around us to help us solve the problem, and how good you are at solving problems in the first place. So those might be the 3 key themes that you might want to include in your essay. Now, those are 3 points. That's kind of perfect because we need at least 3 body paragraphs. Now, when it comes to your word count, you want to have about 10% of your word count in your introduction, about 10% of your word count in your conclusion, and about 80% of your word count in the body paragraph. So, for example, let's say you have an essay that needs to be 1500 words long. That means that your introduction is going to be 150 words long, as well as your conclusion, and you'll want to devote about 1200 words to your body paragraph. If you divide 1200 by 3 body paragraphs, that gives you about 400 words per paragraph. Now, that's pretty good, isn't it? Cool. Now, once you've thought about the 3 main themes you might want to include in your essay, you write it down on that piece of paper that you got. And at this point, no sooner, but only at this point, should you try to do a minimal, like this much, so tiny, such a tiny amount, this much reading, okay? Minimal amount of reading. What I mean by this is go grab your lecture notes, go check out a textbook, see what the subheadings and headings look like. Don't actually read the textbook, just look at the subheadings. And based on this, you might want to make some adjustments. So, after you've thought about your main arguments, you might go on to start doing some more detailed reading. Now, one thing that is very, very important here, when you're doing your detailed reading and you find something that you want to use in your essay, first of all, write the idea down in your own words. Don't write it exactly as it is in the textbook. Write it down in your own words. This will not only guarantee that you actually understand what that piece of information is telling you, but it's also much easier to avoid plagiarism that way, which is the ultimate academic sin. Another very important point at this stage, make sure you write down the references for each and every fact that you write down. Referencing is super important, and trust me, if you don't write down a reference for something and you try to find it later, you're not going to be able to. It's lost forever. Write down every reference that you might potentially want to use. An easy way to do this is just go on to Google Scholar, go on the main search results and click on these little double quotation marks, and that's going to give you the citation that you need for your style of referencing, which is amazing. After having done some detailed reading, you can now move on to adjusting your macro and micro structure based on what you learned. It is possible that the argument you originally wanted to make actually conflicts with the evidence that you found, and that's perfectly fine. That's the whole reason why you're going through this process, why you're doing this in the first place. It is to find scientific information, read about it, educate yourself, and then, change your mind about it, essentially, and change other people's mind about it as well. So if you have to change your argument at this point, that's perfectly fine. This is exactly the reason why we want to plan first instead of actually writing straight away. Okay? Okay. And at this point, it's time to actually write your essay. So let's start with the introduction. Your introduction, like I said, should be about 10% of your word count. And essentially, in an introduction, you want to go from the most general to the most specific, which means the most general thing about the area that you're talking about to your most specific argument that you're making about this particular area. So you might want to start with, a light introduction, like this topic has been widely studied in the past couple of years because it's really cool. Second of all, you should give some sort of definition or description of the area that you're going to be talking about. For example, problem solving is. This is what problem solving means. Next, you want to actually mention your argument or the theme of your essay, what it's actually going to be about. This is where you mention that problem solving is affected by how good of a problem solver you are, what means you have to solve the problem, and how difficult the problem is. Next up, you want to do a little bit of signposting. Tell them what you're actually going to be talking about specifically. This is basically just outlining how you will argue each of your main themes. And that is it for the introduction. If you're not a first-time essay writer, you might have heard about the peel or the ideal structure. Now, I'm gonna talk about the peel structure because that's the one that I've been personally using. The peel structure stands for point, evidence, explain, and link. Now, point, what does that mean? I'm gonna give you a specific example for each one of these, but you have to remember that this structure guide is just that, a guide. This means that in real life your paragraphs are gonna be a little bit different, they're gonna be a bit more wordy, and they're gonna contain a bit more sentences. Of course, depending on the essay you're writing, but it's not gonna be this simplistic, is what I'm trying to say. Also, you might have to repeat this structure multiple times within one point of your main argument. But this again depends on how long your essay is supposed to be. So, example of P or point. One of the major determinants of problem solving is the task environment, which establishes the underlying context of the problem situation. This tells you what the paragraph is going to be about. E for evidence. For example, Schmoozy et al. Found that participants that were given more detailed instructions had a higher success rate. E, that stands for explain. In other words, this study suggests that problem solving depends on the level of instructions given. Now, some people say that you should use link to your next argument, aka your next body paragraph, but the majority of people say that link means linking back to your main argument. That is the one that you stated in your introduction. And that's the one that I have been personally using, and it's been working out fine for me. Now, this part that I'm gonna mention here doesn't have to be in every essay. It depends on how many essays you've written and what is actually required of you personally. But I finished my second year of university, and most of my essays are required to have a critical evaluation in them. Now, critical evaluation is something you would include right before linking back to your main argument or before the link part. In this critical evaluation part, you might want to mention evidence that actually doesn't agree with your main argument. And that's perfectly fine, you know, there's gonna be evidence out there that is like that. That's just the nature of academic writing. So relating to the example sentences, you might say something like, although Schmoozy et al.'s evidence suggests that instructions are really important, this guy, Mr. Bell, actually says that instructions aren't really that important. So if you have two pieces of contrasting evidence, you might just say something like, oh, the evidence on the level of instructions is clearly conflicting, so for now we don't know whether it is important or it isn't important. There, done. Cool. And then after this, you link back to your main argument and basically move on to the next paragraph. Now, the structure of a conclusion is very similar to the introduction, except that it's the other way around. So, whereas in the introduction you go from the most general to most specific, in your conclusion you go from the most specific to the most general. So how you want to start in your conclusion is by offering a summary of what you just talked about. Second of all, you want to reach your conclusion. Say, for example, problem solving is affected by these things because of these reasons that I just mentioned. After that, you might want to mention the significance of the argument or the conclusion that you have reached. For example, does this mean that some theory needs to be reviewed? Does this mean something for policymakers? And lastly, you want to revisit your argument one last time. This is what my argument is, and this is why I made that argument, and this is what it means. Ta-da! Essay done. Now, remember, even if you follow every single step in this process, it is possible that your first essay is not going to be a perfect essay that you get a first on. Those things just happen, and you know, the grades depend on so many factors. Essays are really subjective. You know, one person might think that your essay is amazing, and one person might think that there's a lot to improve in your essay. And it really depends on who gets to grade your essay. And another thing to keep in mind, essay writing and academic writing, just like anything else, it's kind of a skill. You know, you're not going to be amazing at it the first time around. And the best way you can learn how to become a brilliant essay writer is by learning from your mistakes. Once you get your feedback on your first essay, that way, by looking at that feedback, you can move on and improve on those mistakes in your next essay, and then do the same process after that, and after that, after that. And by the end of it, you're gonna be the essay master, and everybody's gonna bow down to you and be like, oh my god, the master of essays, amazing, woo! My point is, you know, it's not gonna happen immediately. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this video. Let me know if you have any questions or anything, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you again at some point. See ya!